I've been asked about that morning maybe 200 times now. Friends, reporters once, my own mother over Sunday lunch, in that careful voice she uses when she's already decided I've done something stupid. And every time people want me to start with the moment, the confrontation, the bit that got photographed. But that's not where it starts. It starts with a hinge. My name is Thomas Vane, corporal at the time. Ashmere Household Division, 2nd Company, and if that sounds grand, it isn't. It means I stood in doorways. It means I knew which floorboards creaked in 3 royal residences and which ones didn't, and that knowledge was, on most days, the most useful thing about me. I was 31, 11 years in. My father had done 19 before me, and my grandfather had done 26 before him. And there's a photograph in my parents' hallway of all 3 of us in uniform at different ages. And if you squint, we're the same man wearing different amounts of tiredness. I say that because I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest. I was not a rebel. I was not clever. I had never once in 11 years done anything that made anyone look at me twice. That was the whole point of me. Kelvin House sits about 40 minutes outside the Capitol, at the end of a road that doesn't want to be found. Beech trees on both sides, so old they've grown into each other overhead. And in autumn the whole approach turns into this tunnel of copper light that makes people slow down without meaning to. The house itself is smaller than you'd think. 11 bedrooms, gray stone that's gone soft-looking with age, a gravel forecourt, a set of shallow steps, and a black front door with a brass knocker shaped like a hare. Prince Edric and Princess Ilsa had been given it in the spring. Officially, it was a transition of residence. Unofficially, everyone knew what it was the young couple wanted out of the Capitol, out of the palace corridors, away from the 1,100 people who worked in that building and the 400 who talked about them. They had 2 children, a boy 4, a girl 18 months, and just learning that she could scream on purpose. They wanted a house, not a wing, a house. I was posted there in April. There were 6 of us on rotation, plus the protection officers, who are a different animal entirely, plain clothes, earpieces, and a way of looking through you that I never got used to. We ceremonial lot were the visible ones. The ones in the coat and the bearskin, standing at the door looking like a postcard. People think that's all we are, decoration. I've stopped arguing about it. Now the hinge. 2nd week of September. Tuesday. I remember it was Tuesday because Tuesdays were when the estate manager, a man called Barrow, did his walk round, and Barrow had the unusual quality of actually listening when you told him something. I told him the front door hinge was going. He said, "Going how?" I said, "It drops about 4 millimeters when it swings past halfway. You can hear it catch on the stone." He looked at me for a second, then he said, "You can hear 4 millimeters." And I said, "I've stood next to that door for 5 months, Mr. Barrow. I could hear 4 millimeters in my sleep." He laughed, wrote it down, said he'd get someone. That's it, that's the whole exchange. It took maybe 40 seconds and I forgot about it before lunch. But I want you to remember it, because in about 6 weeks, that hinge is going to matter more than anything else in this story. Autumn came in fast that year. By the middle of October, the beaches had gone, the gravel was permanently wet, and the light died at about 4:30 in the afternoon like someone had unplugged it. The kind of cold that doesn't bite, just settles, gets into the coat, gets into the boots, sits there. You learn things standing still. You learn that a house has a rhythm. Kelvin House woke at 6:10, when the kitchen light came on. At 6:45 you'd hear the boy. He'd got into the habit of running the upstairs corridor in socks, and there was a specific thump-thump-thump skid that meant he'd reached the top of the stairs and remembered he wasn't allowed to go down them alone. Princess Ilsa came out most mornings around 8. Not to speak to us, that's not how it works, and I'd never have expected it. But she'd come out onto the steps with a coffee and just stand there for a minute in a coat over pajamas, looking at the trees. I never once looked directly at her when she did that. It felt like walking in on something. The prince left at 7:30 usually. Engagements, papers, whatever the job actually is. And then the house would go quiet, and I'd stand there and the day would happen around me. I was happy. I don't say that often about work, but I was. It was a good post. Nobody was fighting, nobody was performing. It was, for about 4 months, the least royal residence I'd ever been at. The first sign came on a Thursday. A car I didn't recognize came up the drive at about 11 in the morning. Dark green, older model but the good kind of old, the kind that costs money to keep looking that way. I logged it. That's the job, everything gets logged, every arrival, every departure, times to the minute. A woman got out, 60s, silver hair pinned back, no fuss about it, green wax coat. She stood in the forecourt for maybe 90 seconds and just looked at the house. Not at the door, at the house, the roofline, the windows, like a surveyor. Then she got back in the car and left. She never came within 30 feet of me. I logged it, vehicle description, plate time in, time out, no contact, standard. That evening, the chief inspector on the protection team, a quiet Scottish bloke called Muir, came and read my log, and stood there for a bit longer than he needed to. He said, "You get her name." I said, "No contact made, sir, she didn't approach." He said, "Right," and tapped the page twice and walked off. He didn't tell me who it was. I found out 3 weeks later. Dowager Duchess Rowan of Ashmere. Prince Edric's aunt, technically, married in, widowed young, and then simply stayed. For 34 years she had stayed, and in that time she had become something the family didn't have a word for. She wasn't in the line. She had no formal role. She'd never been given a household of her own. And she ran, by my honest estimate, about a third of the family's private life. Not through power, through knowledge. She knew which cousin owed money. She knew which marriages were fine and which ones were staged. She knew what the old Duke had said on his deathbed, because she'd been the one holding his hand, and she had been repeating selected portions of it for 3 decades to whoever needed managing that week. The staff loved her, genuinely. She remembered names, birthdays, the fact that your mother had been ill. She'd send handwritten notes. She once got a footman's son into a school he had no business getting into and never mentioned it again. And every single person who worked for that family, from the private secretaries down to the men who cut the lawns, was a little bit afraid of her. I'd met her exactly twice before Kelvin House. Both times at the Capitol, both times briefly, and both times she'd said something so precisely pleasant that I'd thought about it for 2 days afterwards, trying to work out whether it had been a compliment. That was her gift. She didn't push, she arranged. She came back the following Tuesday. This time she came to the door. I saw the car at the bottom of the drive, and something in my chest did a small, unhelpful thing. I straightened up, checked the coat, checked the position of my feet on the stone, which after 11 years is a thing your body does without consulting you. She got out, same green coat. She had a folder under one arm and reading glasses pushed up into her hair. She came up the steps, and about 4 feet from me she stopped and she smiled and she said, "Corporal, good morning, filthy weather." And I said, "Ma'am." That's all we say. That's the whole vocabulary. You'd be amazed what you can do with it. She said, "Is Her Royal Highness in?" And I said, "Ma'am, I'd have to ask you to speak to the household." Which is the correct answer. It's the only answer. I don't announce people. I don't confirm who's inside a building. I don't do anything except stand where I'm standing and refer you to someone whose job it actually is. She knew that. She'd known that for 34 years. She looked at me for a second. Then she laughed a proper laugh, warm, slightly rueful, and she said, "Of course, quite right, I'm being lazy." And she pressed the bell. Ilsa's private secretary came out. There was a conversation on the steps I couldn't hear. And then the Duchess went inside, and stayed for 2 hours and 10 minutes, and came out looking absolutely delighted with herself. She stopped again on the way past. She said, "Vain, isn't it?" And I didn't answer because I don't, but something must have moved in my face because she nodded like I had. She said, "Your father served the old Duke, Roland Vane, Color Sergeant." I still didn't answer. She said, "He was a very good man. He carried my husband's coffin. Did you know that?" I didn't. She smiled and went to her car and drove away, and I stood there for the remaining 2 hours of my shift with my jaw locked and my eyes on the tree line, and something absolutely rotten sitting in my stomach. Because I understood exactly what had just happened. She hadn't been being kind. She'd been telling me she knew where I came from. She came 4 more times in the next fortnight. Tuesdays and Fridays, always the folder, always the glasses in the hair, Always that warm, unhurried way of moving that made you feel rude for being in a hurry yourself. And the house started to change. I noticed it the way you notice weather changing, not one moment, just a general shift in pressure. Princess Ilsa stopped coming out onto the steps in the mornings. That's the first thing. She just stopped. 4 months of standing there with a coffee looking at the trees, and then 1 week nothing. The estate manager, Barrow, got quiet. He used to chat, he stopped chatting. The under-butler, a young lad called Feld, came out to the door one afternoon to bring me a message, and his hands were shaking. Actually shaking. I asked if he was all right, and he said, "Fine, Corporal," in a voice that was about 9 years old. And there started to be lists. That's the bit nobody outside believes. Lists typed, appearing on the household notice board unsigned in a font nobody used, which rooms were to be kept unlocked, what time the children were to be brought down, which windows should have the curtains open at what hour. Small things, absurdly small things. One of them said the hall flowers were to be white only. They'd been yellow since April. Ilsa liked yellow. They went white that Thursday. I want to be fair here, because I've thought about this for a long time, and I've had people tell me I made her into a villain, and maybe I did. She was not doing anything wrong. That's the thing, that's the whole difficult thing. She was an aunt. She was helping. A young couple with 2 small children and a house they didn't know how to run, and here was a woman with 34 years of knowing exactly how these houses are run, offering to take some weight off. Every individual act was kind. It was only when you stood in a doorway for 8 hours a day, for 6 weeks, watching the whole thing from the outside like a very slow film, only then did you see the shape of it. She wasn't helping them run the house. She was learning it, room by room, habit by habit, person by person. And she was very, very good at it. The thing that broke it open for me was the boy. Prince Edric and Princess Ilsa's son, 4 years old. Name was Casper, which I always thought was a slightly odd choice for that family, and I liked them more for it. He used to come out to the door. Not officially. He'd escape. He'd get away from whoever was watching him and belt down the hall and appear at the front door in socks, and he'd stand next to me, not talking to me, because he'd been told very seriously that he mustn't. And he'd stand there with his hands behind his back, trying to do the face. Trying to stand still. He'd last about 11 seconds. Then he'd giggle and someone would come and get him and he'd be carried off shouting. And I would not move a single muscle, and it was, I'm not joking, the best part of my week. He did that maybe twice a week for 4 months. And then in November he stopped. I noticed on a Wednesday, 2 weeks I realized, 2 weeks no boy. Feld came out with the afternoon changeover and I broke a rule. I asked. I said, is the young gentleman all right? Not seen him about. And Feld, this 22-year-old kid who'd been shaking a fortnight earlier, Feld looked at the gravel and said, he's been told not to come to the front door. I said, told by who? And Feld said, it was on the list. That night I went home to my flat and sat on the end of the bed with my boots still on for about 40 minutes. Here's what I was thinking. I was thinking, this is not my business. I was thinking, I am a corporal. I'm a man in a coat who stands next to a door. There are private secretaries in this operation who earn 6 times what I do and have degrees in this exact problem, and there is a protection team with earpieces, and there is an entire palace machine 3 miles that way whose actual job is to know when something's wrong. And if all of them are fine with it, then who exactly do I think I am? I was thinking about my father. 19 years. Never once, not one time in 19 years, did that man make himself part of a story. He'd have told me to stand up straight and mind my own post, and he'd have been right. And I was thinking about a 4-year-old in socks, standing next to me with his hands behind his back, trying to be still. And how he wasn't allowed at his own front door anymore. The last week of November, Barrow came out to see me at the end of my shift. Barrow had gone very gray, not hair, face. He said, Corporal, can I ask you something off the record? I said, you can ask, Mr. Barrow. He said, the hinge. And I said, what? He said, the front door hinge. You told me about it in September. I said, yeah, did anyone come? He said, that's what I'm asking, because it's been fixed. I said, right, good. And he said, I didn't fix it, Corporal. I never raised the job. It's not on any of my sheets. And last Tuesday I put my hand on that door and it swings clean. We looked at each other. I said, so somebody had a joiner in, so what? And Barrow said, nobody signs a contractor into this estate but me. Nobody. That's the whole of my job, that one thing. So either a man came onto a protected royal property, worked on the principal entrance and left, and nobody logged him. He stopped. I finished it for him. Or somebody who isn't you signed him in. Barrow didn't answer. He just nodded once and walked back into the house. I need you to understand why that mattered, because from outside it sounds like nothing. A door hinge, who cares? Here's who cares. The front door of a royal residence is not a door. It's a control point. Everything about it is documented. The lock, the frame, the alarm contacts, the sight lens from the camera on the gable. If you change so much as the screws, that gets recorded, because 6 months from now when something goes wrong, somebody is going to sit in a room and reconstruct that door from paper. A contractor on that door unlogged is not a maintenance issue. It's a hole, and somebody had made a hole in the front door of the house where those 2 children slept. And they'd done it because they were being helpful. Because the hinge was noisy, and the noisy hinge woke the baby, and it was on a list. I went and looked at it that night after the changeover when I had 11 minutes and no reason to be there. I put my hand on the door and swung it. It was beautiful, silent, smooth, dead-weight balance the whole arc. Whoever had done it was a proper tradesman. I crouched down and looked at the bottom hinge. New screws, brass. Longer than the originals, I could tell because the countersinks hadn't been reamed to match, and there was a hairline of bright metal showing where the head sat proud by 0.5 millimeter. Somebody had gone into the frame deeper than before. And on the inside edge of the jamb, at the height of the middle hinge, tucked in the shadow where the door sat closed, there was a small round hole in the wood, maybe 4 millimeters across, filled with a plug of putty that was almost the right color. I stared at it for a long time. Then I stood up and I went back to my post, and I stood there in the dark with my heart going like a hammer, and I thought, I could be wrong. I could be so wrong. It could be a plug. It could be a pilot hole from 1890. It could be woodworm. It could be nothing, and I could be a corporal who'd been standing in a cold doorway for 5 months inventing a conspiracy because a nice old woman had mentioned his dad. And if I said anything at all about the Dowager Duchess of Ashmere based on a hole in a door frame, then I would be finished. Not sacked. Worse, I'd be the one who'd had a funny turn, quietly moved, given a desk. 22 more years of people going quiet when I walked in. 11 years of never being looked at twice. Gone. For a hinge. I did nothing for 9 days. I want that on the record because in every version of this story that's been told about me, I come out as the man who acted, the man who stood firm. I did nothing for 9 days. I stood at that door and I watched her car come up the drive on the Tuesday and the Friday, and I said, ma'am. And I looked at the tree line and I did absolutely nothing. And on the 9th day, the 4th of December, at 4 minutes past 9 in the morning, the household diary for Kelvin House was amended. I saw it on the board at changeover. 10:30 HRH the princess and children depart for the capital. Return 18:00. 11:00 Dowager Duchess Rowena. Access to principal floor, household to assist. Both of them, the princess out, the duchess in. For the first time in 6 weeks, the duchess was coming to Kelvin House when nobody who lived there would be inside it. And I stood in front of that board in a corridor that smelled of wet coats and floor polish, with the changeover happening around me and men talking about football, and I felt the whole thing lock into place like a bolt going home. She wasn't visiting. She'd never been visiting. At 10:30 I would watch that car take Ilsa and those 2 children away down the beach tunnel. And at 11, I would be the only thing standing between the Dowager Duchess of Ashmere and an empty house she had spent 6 weeks learning by heart. Me, a corporal in a coat, next to a door that didn't creak anymore. There's a thing they teach you in the first month, and it sounds like nonsense until the day it isn't. They tell you you are not making a decision at the door. You made it in the guardroom. Meaning, by the time something's happening in front of you, It's too late to be clever. You'll have about 2 seconds, and your heart will be doing 140, and you will do whatever you already decided to do at some quiet moment beforehand. And if you never had that quiet moment, you'll do nothing. I had my quiet moment at 6:20 in the morning on the 4th of December, sitting in my car in the estate car park with the engine off, and the windows going white with my own breathing. I decided I was going to be wrong. That's the honest version. I didn't decide to be brave. I decided that if I was wrong, if it was Woodworm and a helpful aunt and a corporal who'd lost the plot, then I'd rather be wrong loudly and lose the job than be right quietly and spend the rest of my life knowing. That was it, 6:20, cold car, that was the whole heroic bit. Everything after that was just admin. The morning was that particular gray you only get in December, where the sky isn't cloudy so much as absent. No shadows, no depth. The beaches were bare by then, and the drive had gone from a tunnel to a set of ribs. It had rained in the night. The gravel was dark, and it made that sound, that specific wet crunch, deeper than dry gravel, almost a chuff, and I could hear a car coming from about 200 meters out. I went on post at 8. 7:30 the prince left. Same as always. Papers under his arm, protection officer at the car, and he looked tired in a way that had been building for about a month, and that I'd been pretending not to notice. 9:45, the boy came down the hall. I heard him. Thump, thump, thump on the stairs, and then a stop, a real stop, dead 3 feet from the door, and then a woman's voice, low, and then footsteps going away. He didn't come out. I looked at the tree line, and I felt something in my chest go hard and useful. At 10:28, the car came round for Princess Ilsa. She came out with the baby on her hip and Casper's hand in hers, and the nanny behind them with the bags, and she stopped at the bottom of the steps to get his coat sorted because he'd got one arm in the wrong sleeve. And Casper looked up at me. 4 years old, red wellies, one arm stuck. He didn't wave, he'd been told. He just looked. And I want to tell you I gave him something, a wink, a nod, something, but I didn't because I don't, because that's not what I'm there for. I stood exactly as still as I had for 11 years. But I saw him, and I think he knew I saw him. Then Ilsa got the sleeve sorted and picked him up and put him in the car, and the doors shut, and the car went down the drive and into the ribs of the beaches and gone. I looked at my watch. 10:31. 29 minutes. Here's what I'd done, by the way, in the 9 days. Nothing dramatic. I want to be clear about that because people assume there was some plan. I'd written it down. That's all. Every night for 9 nights I'd gone home and written the day out in a cheap notebook from a petrol station. Times, vehicles, who came out, who didn't. The lists on the board, I'd copied 3 of them word for word. The date Feld told me about the boy. The date Barrow told me about the hinge. What I saw when I looked at the bottom hinge, described plainly, with a note saying I am not a joiner and I may be wrong about this. 9 days of the most boring document ever produced. And on the morning of the 4th, I'd put it in the inside pocket of my greatcoat, folded in half, against my ribs. Not as evidence, I wasn't that organized. I put it there because I knew that in about 4 hours I was going to be sitting in a room being asked what happened, and I knew that my memory would be useless. And I wanted something in my pocket that had been written by a calmer man than the one who'd be sitting in that room. At 11:03, I heard the gravel. Green car, same as always. She parked exactly where she always parked. She was never sloppy about anything, that woman. Even her parking was polite. She got out, green wax coat, glasses in the hair, folder under the arm. And behind her, out of the passenger side, came a man. That was new. 50s, overcoat, no hat. Soft leather bag over his shoulder, the flat kind, the kind that holds paper and not much else. He had that stillness that expensive men have, where they don't look around at things because nothing they see is going to be new. They came up the steps together. She stopped at 4 feet, exactly 4 feet, same as every other time. She said, "Corporal, good morning." I said, "Ma'am." She said, "Filthy weather. I think we've forgotten what the sun looks like." And I said nothing, because that wasn't a question, and because my throat had gone somewhere else. She turned slightly and gestured at the man, warm, easy. She said, "This is Mr. Aldous. He's a surveyor." We're going to have a look at the principal floor. The damp in the west corridor is genuinely frightening, and nobody's done a thing about it since the 80s. Mr. Aldous nodded at me, pleasant nothing in it. And she moved. Not fast, she didn't barge. She simply took a half step, the way you do when a conversation's finished, the way a person moves when they've been through a door 1,000 times and the door has never once been a question. And I moved too. I want to describe this properly because it's the bit that got photographed, and the photograph is a lie. In the photograph it looks like a wall. It looks like a big man in a heavy coat physically barring an old woman from a doorway, arm out, chest square, and it looks like violence. And for about 2 weeks that photograph was the only thing anybody in this country knew about me. It wasn't like that. What I did was I took one step, sideways, onto the center line of the door. That's it, one step, about 16 inches. I didn't touch her. I never touched her. I never raised a hand. I never raised my voice. I never said a single word she could have written down. I just stopped being beside the door and started being in front of it. And she stopped. And there was a silence on those steps that I can still hear. She looked at me. And for about a second and a half, I've thought about this a lot, for about a second and a half, something came off her face. Not anger, it wasn't anger. It was calculation. The warmth just switched off, like a light in a room you're not in anymore, and underneath there was a woman doing arithmetic very fast. Then it came back on. She smiled and she said lightly, "Corporal, I think you might be standing in my way." And I said, "Ma'am." She waited. I didn't move. She said, "Is there an issue with the diary? I believe I'm expected at 11. And I said, "Ma'am, I'd ask you to speak to the household." Same sentence, the same 8 words I'd said to her in October, the only sentence I had. She said, "The household is aware. Mrs. Croft has the note." And I said, "Ma'am, I'd ask you to speak to the household." That was the first attempt, charm. The second one came about 40 seconds later, and it was cleverer. She didn't argue with me. That's what a lesser person would have done, argued, escalated, demanded, and given me something to write in a log. She did the opposite. She stepped back half a step, made herself smaller, and she said gently, almost apologetically, "Thomas, may I call you Thomas? You look absolutely exhausted." And that landed, God help me, that landed like a punch. Because I was exhausted, 9 days, 4 hours of sleep a night. And she'd said it like she'd noticed, like she'd been noticing for weeks, and there was a part of me that was 31 years old and very tired and wanted very much for a kind woman in a green coat to be right about something. She said, "I know these last months have been difficult here. The house isn't settled. Everyone's on edge. I'm not going to pretend I haven't noticed." She looked at me and her eyes were completely, absolutely sincere. She said, "Whatever you think is happening, I promise you, you've got the wrong end of it. And I'd hate for a good man to break himself over a misunderstanding at a door." And then she said, "Your father would have hated that. He was the least dramatic man I ever met." I've been asked what I felt when she said that. The honest answer is relief. Because for 9 days I'd been carrying this thing on my own and telling myself I was mad. And the second she said my father's name, I knew, all the way down that I wasn't. Because a woman who was innocent doesn't reach for that. An aunt who's come to check the damp doesn't, when a corporal steps in front of a door, immediately go looking for the softest place in his ribs. She'd gone for my father in October to tell me she knew where I came from. She was going for him in December to tell me she knew what she could take away. And it was so smooth, it was so practiced, and I remember thinking very clearly with a kind of cold wonder, how many times has this worked? 34 years, how many footmen, how many secretaries? How many men in coats standing next to doors, who'd been reminded gently that somebody knew their father's name? I said, "Ma'am," and I looked at the tree line, and she stopped smiling. The third attempt wasn't an attempt. It was the real thing, and it took about 11 seconds. She said, "Corporal Vane, look at me." I did. She said, and her voice hadn't gone loud, it had gone flat. All the music out of it, she said. "I have been coming through that door since before you were born. I sat with the old Duke in the room behind you for 9 weeks while he died. I have never once in my life been asked to explain myself on a doorstep, and I am not going to begin with you." She let that sit. Then she said, "Step aside." And there it was. No paperwork, no authority. No warrant, no order, no line of command, no signature. Just 34 years of nobody ever having said no. That was the whole engine. That was what had moved every list and every list follower in that house for 6 weeks. She'd never needed power. She just needed nobody to check. I said, "Ma'am, I'm not able to permit access. I'd ask you to speak to the household." And she said, "That is not your decision." And I said, and this is the only thing I said in the entire 6 minutes that wasn't one of my 8 words, and I've thought about whether I regret it, and I don't. I said, "Ma'am, at this door today it is." Mr. Aldous cleared his throat. That was when I knew. Because he'd been standing there for 4 minutes, and a surveyor, an actual surveyor, a man who's come to look at damp, would have been bored. He'd have been checking his phone. He'd have been looking at the guttering. Aldous hadn't moved. Aldous had been watching my hands. He cleared his throat and he said, quietly to her, not to me, "Perhaps another day." And she turned her head about 10 degrees and looked at him. And Aldous shut up. She came back to me. She said, "What's your service number, Corporal?" And I told her, clearly, twice because she asked me to repeat it, and I understood exactly why she'd asked me to repeat it, and I did it anyway. She wrote it in the folder. Then she closed the folder, and she looked up at the house, past me, at the windows, at the roofline, the way she had that very first Thursday in October, and she said, almost to herself, "Well, that's a shame." And she went down the steps and got into the green car with Mr. Aldous, and it went down the drive and into the ribs of the beeches and gone. 11:06. 6 minutes. That was the whole thing. 6 minutes, and I never touched her, and neither of us ever raised our voice. I stood there for another 2 hours and 54 minutes. That's the part nobody puts in the story. There's no music, nobody comes out. The house behind me was empty, and the drive was empty, and the sky was that absent gray. And I stood on the center line of that door with my hands going numb, and the adrenaline drained out of me over about 40 minutes and left behind the worst nausea I've ever had while upright. I thought, I've just ended it. 11 years, my dad's 19, my grandfather's 26. Over. And I stood there. Because that's the job. The job isn't the 6 minutes. The job is the 2 hours and 54 minutes afterwards, when it's done and it's cost you everything and there's nobody to see, and you stand there anyway because the door hasn't stopped being a door. Chief Inspector Muir came at 2. He came out of the house. He'd been inside the whole time, which I hadn't known and which I still find funny in a bleak way, and he stood next to me and looked out at the drive for a bit. Then he said, "Heard you had a visitor." I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Anything in the log?" I said, "Everything's in the log, sir." He said, I've read it." And then he was quiet for a long moment, and he said, "There's a photograph, Thomas." I hadn't known about the photograph. Nobody had. That's the thing that still gets me. There'd been no press at that gate for months, no long lenses, nothing. Kelvin House was boring. That was its entire appeal. A man on a public footpath, 400 meters out on the rise where the bridleway crosses. He wasn't press. He was a birdwatcher, genuinely, actually a birdwatcher, with a long lens and a lifetime list and a lot of patience. And he'd heard raised voices carry across a wet field and swung the lens over on instinct. He'd taken 4 frames. The one that got out was frame 3. Me front on, coat, big, stepping across the door. Her from behind, small, gray head, green coat, an old woman on a step being stopped. He didn't sell it. I want that said. He didn't make a penny. He put it on a birding forum with a caption asking if anyone knew what was going on at Kelvin House because he was a bit shaken, and it was on a national front page in 19 hours. Muir told me all of that in about 4 sentences, flat, no color. Then he said, "The Duchess's office has made a complaint, formal. It's with the household by now, probably further." I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "You're off post at 4, don't go home, there's a room at the Capitol." And I said, "Yes, sir." He turned to go, and then he stopped and he came back, and he stood in front of me, properly in front of me, so I had to look at him, and he said something I didn't understand for another 11 days. He said, "Thomas, when they ask you, and they will ask you tomorrow, and they'll ask it 4 different ways, they're going to want to know why. Why today? Why her? What made a corporal with a clean sheet do that on a Tuesday morning?" He said, "Don't give them the woman." I said, "Sir." And Muir said, "Give them the door." And he walked back into the house. I came off post at 4 in the dark. There was a car for me, which there had never been before. And as I walked round to it, I passed the front door, the actual door, closed now, brass hair gleaming, and I stopped for about 3 seconds and put my hand flat on it. New screws, long ones, countersinks not reamed to match. And a small round hole in the jamb, 4 millimeters, plugged with putty that was almost the right color. I'd said nothing about it, not to Muir, not to Barrow, not to anyone. It was in a petrol station notebook, folded in half, in the inside pocket of my greatcoat against my ribs. And I got in the car and we went down the drive, and I looked back once through the rear window at Kelvin House with all its windows lit and nobody in it. I genuinely believed at that moment that I would never see it again. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about nearly everything, as it turned out. But not about the door. The room they put me in the next morning had a carpet the color of porridge and a window that looked at a wall. 3 of them, a colonel I'd never met. A woman from the household who never gave a name, just a nod, and wrote the entire time without ever once looking at her page. And a man in a gray suit at the end of the table who said nothing at all for the first 50 minutes and turned out, in the end, to be the only one who mattered. There was a jug of water and 4 glasses. Nobody drank any of it. I sat down and put my hands flat on my knees, because that's what my father did when he was nervous, and I only noticed I was doing it about an hour later. The colonel said, "Corporal Vane, do you understand why you're here?" And I said, "Yes, sir." And he said, "Tell us." Muir was right, they asked 4 times. Not 4 questions, 4 shapes of the same question, and they were so good at it that I didn't notice the shape changing until the 3rd one. The first one was the soft one. "Just talk us through the morning." So I did, times, vehicles, who arrived, who left. 8 minutes flat, no color, the woman wrote without looking down. Then the colonel said, "And what were you thinking when she came up those steps?" And there it was, attempt 1. What were you thinking? Because if I answered that, if I said I thought she was up to something, if I said I'd been watching her for 6 weeks, if I gave them one single sentence about that woman's character, then the whole thing becomes a corporal's opinion of a duchess. And a corporal's opinion of a duchess is not a fact, it's a symptom. I said, "Sir, I don't think I can usefully answer that." He said, "Try." I said, "I was thinking about the door, sir." The man in the gray suit looked up for about a second, and then looked back down at his hands. The second attempt was the kind one, and it was the worst. The woman from the household put her pen down, first time in 50 minutes. She had a face like a nice teacher. She said, "Corporal, nobody in this room thinks you're a bad man. You've an exemplary record. 11 years, not a mark on it." She let that sit. Which is why we're all a bit puzzled, because good men don't usually do something like this out of nowhere. Usually there's a strain, something at home, something they've been carrying. She said, "Is there anything you'd like to tell us about how you've been?" And God, it was gentle, it was so gentle. It was the same knife Rowena had used on the step. "You look absolutely exhausted, Thomas." Same family, same instincts, same reflex. When a small man does something inconvenient, don't argue with the thing he did. Argue with the man. I said, "Ma'am, I've been fine." She said, "You're certain?" I said, "I've been fine. I'd like to talk about the door." Third attempt was the direct one, the colonel leaning back. "Corporal, did you form a personal view of her grace?" Straight at it, no dressing. And I sat there for a good 5 seconds, because I badly wanted to answer that. I wanted to tell them about the lists, about the flowers going white, about Feld's hands shaking, about a 4-year-old boy who wasn't allowed at his own front door. I wanted it so much my jaw hurt. And I thought about Muir standing in front of me in the cold saying, "Don't give them the woman." And I understood, finally, sitting in that porridge-colored room, that he hadn't been protecting me. He'd been protecting the fact. Because a fact can be checked. An opinion can only be believed or disbelieved, and I was a corporal, and she'd sat with the old Duke for 9 weeks while he died. I said, "Sir, I have no view of her grace." He said, "None." I said, "None that's worth this room's time, sir." Fourth attempt came from the gray suit. He'd said nothing for 50 minutes, and then he said, without moving, in a voice like a man reading a shipping forecast, "Then why did you stop her, Corporal?" And I reached into my jacket, and I took out a notebook from a petrol station, folded in half, and I put it on the table. And I said, "Because on some date I can't establish, an unidentified tradesman entered a protected royal residence, carried out structural work on the principal entrance, and left. He was not signed in. He is not on any sheet. The estate manager didn't raise the job and doesn't know who did." I said, "I don't know who she is, sir. I know what happened to that door." Nobody said anything for a while. The woman from the household picked her pen back up. The gray suit reached out and turned the notebook around with one finger and opened it and read the whole thing, all 9 days. It took him about 6 minutes and none of us moved. Then he closed it and said, "You wrote, 'I am not a joiner and I may be wrong about this.'" I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Why?" I said, "Because I'm not, sir, and I might be." He looked at me for a long moment, and then he said to the colonel, without any change in his voice at all, "I'd like the alarm contractor at Kelvin House by 2 o'clock, please, and I'd like nobody to touch that door." Here's what it was. I'm going to say it plainly because when it was finally explained to me, it took about 40 seconds, and it made me feel sick for a week. The front door of Kelvin House had a contact on it, a little magnetic switch, one half in the door, one half in the frame. Door closed, magnets together, circuit reads closed. Door opens, magnets part, circuit breaks, system knows. Every door in that house had one. Every door in every house like it anywhere. It's not clever. It's about as clever as a light switch. But it's the thing that means that at 3 in the morning, somewhere, a screen knows whether that door is shut. When the joiner rehung the door, he'd gone deeper into the frame. Longer screws, better bite, and he'd done a beautiful job. Genuinely, the man was a craftsman, and I'll say that till I die. But going deeper meant he'd hit the wire run. So he did what a good tradesman does when he's not been briefed, and there's no drawing and nobody official to ask. He solved it. He rerouted the loop, drilled a lead-through in the jamb, 4 millimeters, took the wire round the new screw path, plugged the hole with putty, and made the whole thing tidy. And in doing it, with the best intentions in the world, with real skill, in about 20 minutes, he'd bridged the contact. Meaning the circuit read closed. Permanently. Meaning that from some day in October until the 5th of December, the front door of Kelvin House told the system it was shut. Whether it was or not, 2 children slept in that house every night for roughly 7 weeks behind a door that could not report itself. That's it, that's the whole crime. Nobody bugged anything. Nobody was plotting a murder. There was no plot at all, and I want to be honest about that, because for a while I'd let myself imagine one, and I was wrong, and being wrong about that is the thing I'd want corrected if only one thing about me got corrected. The Dowager Duchess of Ashmere did not want to hurt anybody. She just wanted the hinge quiet, because the hinge woke the baby, and she was the sort of woman who fixed things, and she knew a man, and she'd rung him, and he'd come, and it was done by tea time, and wasn't that better than 11 weeks of forms? She didn't sign him in because it never once occurred to her that she was the kind of person who signs people in. 34 years of nobody checking. That's all it takes. They tested the door at 2:30 on the 5th of December. I wasn't there. I heard about it from Barrow months later, and Barrow told it like a man describing a funeral. Engineer opens the door, wide, all the way right back against the stop. Everybody looks at the panel. Panel says closed. And apparently this is the detail that finishes me. Apparently the engineer thought it was a fault in his kit. Reset it. Did it again. Panel says closed. Did it a 3rd time, and stood there with the front door of a royal residence hanging wide open on a December afternoon with the cold pouring into the hall, watching a screen tell him it was shut. And Barrow said the room went so quiet you could hear the gravel settling. Nothing happened to me. I want to be careful about that word. Nothing is not the same as justice. The complaint was withdrawn. Not thrown out, not upheld, withdrawn quietly on the 11th of December by a person who was never named, in a letter I never saw. I was returned to duty on the 15th. Different post at first. I did 4 months at a place in the north that I'm not going to describe because it's still in use. And then, in April, without anybody making a thing of it, I was put back on the Kelvin House rotation. That's the closest thing to a medal I got. They gave me my door back. Nobody ever said well done. Nobody said sorry. There was no moment. That's not how that world works, and honestly, if there had been a moment, I think I'd have trusted it less. Muir did shake my hand. Once in a corridor, no words, that'll do. Now the Duchess. She wasn't punished. Let's be clear about that too, because I know what you want and I wanted it as well. In February, it was announced that Her Grace the Dowager Duchess of Ashmere would be taking up residence at a house on the West Coast. A very beautiful house. Genuinely, I've seen photographs. It's magnificent. It's got a wall of glass looking at the sea and a garden that's on the tourist maps. She was given a household of her own, staff, a secretary, the thing she'd wanted apparently for 34 years. It was in every paper as a gift, a recognition of decades of service to the family. It was 310 miles from the capital. Nobody said a word. Nobody ever will. The word for what happened to her doesn't exist in that family's vocabulary, and that is precisely why the family still exists. She never spoke about me, not once in public ever. And I've come to think that was the most respectful thing she could have done, in her own way. And I've come to think she knew exactly what she'd done, the moment they told her about the panel, and that she has thought about that panel every single day since. I hope she has. I'm not proud of hoping that. The photograph, though. The photograph never went away. For about 11 days, I was the biggest bastard in the country. Frame 3, me front on, huge in the coat. Her from behind, small, gray, green wax coat, an old woman stopped on a wet step by a man twice her size. The headlines wrote themselves. JOBSWRTH, the guard who humiliated Her Grace. One of them ran a public anger AT Palace bully splash with my service photo next to hers, and put a red circle round my face like I'd done a robbery. And here's the thing, nobody could say anything. Not Muir, not Barrow, not the household. Because the truth was a security failure at a royal residence, and you do not, under any circumstances, put that in a newspaper. So the correction was never printed because the correction couldn't be printed, and it still can't, and I've changed enough in this telling that I can say it at all. My mother rang me on the 3rd day, crying. She said, "Thomas, they're saying you pushed her." And I said, "Mum, I never touched her." And she said, "And this is the bit that took me about 2 years to forgive," she said. "But why couldn't you just have let her in?" I didn't have an answer for her. That's the honest, unheroic center of the whole thing. I stood in my kitchen at 9:10 at night with my mother crying down the phone at me, and there was a perfect, complete, unanswerable answer sitting in a locked report in a building 3 miles away that I was never, ever going to be allowed to say out loud. And so I said, "I don't know, Mum." And she said, "Oh, Thomas." And we talked about her hip for 11 minutes, and then we hung up. That's what it costs, not the job. I got to keep the job. It costs you the explanation. You do the right thing, and then you go home, and you're just the man in the photograph, and you eat your dinner, and the thing you did stays in a room you'll never be in again, and the only person on earth who knows the whole shape of it is you. If you can't live with that, don't take the coat. I went back in April. Same drive. The beaches had come back in that green they only do for about 10 days before it goes dark and serious. The gravel was dry for once. Same brass hair on the black door. New hinges, new contact. New everything, actually. They'd done the whole entrance properly with drawings and sign-offs and 11 weeks of forms, and it was perfect, and it made a noise. A small one, a sort of soft talk right at the end of the swing. I stood there on my first morning back, and heard it, and something in me came loose that had been tight since December. Barrow came out at about 10 and stood next to me for a minute without saying anything. Then he said, "They'll fix that noise, you know. Someone'll complain." And I said, "Mr. Barrow, If anyone touches that door, I'll break their arm." And he laughed so hard he had to walk away. Princess Ilsa started coming out onto the steps again that spring. Coat over pajamas, coffee, looking at the trees. Not every day, but most. She never mentioned it. Never once, not in the 4 years I stood at that door afterwards, did she say a single word to me about the 4th of December, and I'd have been mortified if she had. But in May, on a Thursday, the hall flowers went yellow again. And I stood outside with my back to them, and I felt, I don't know, something, like a fever going. And then, on a morning in June, I heard it. Thump, 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 skid. 4-year-old, 5 by then, in socks, down the hall, dead stop at the top of the steps. And a woman's voice behind him, and I braced for it. And the voice said, "Boots, Casper, if you're going out, you're wearing boots." He came out in red wellies with his pajama bottoms tucked in, and he stood next to me with his hands behind his back. He didn't talk, he'd been told. He just stood there, trying to do the face, trying to be still. Chin up, shoulders back, absolutely rigid, quivering with the effort of it, a small, furious statue in Wellingtons. He lasted about 11 seconds. Then he giggled, and someone came and got him, and he was carried off shouting, and I did not move a single muscle. And I stood there in the June sun outside a house with the door open behind me and the flowers yellow in the hall, and I thought, that's the whole thing, that's what it was for. Not the truth, I never got the truth. Just a boy allowed to stand at his own front door. People still ask me about that morning, 200 times easily. They always want the drama. They want to know if I was scared, if she shouted, if I nearly cracked. They want me to say something about courage. And I never know what to tell them, because there wasn't any courage in it. There was a man in a coat who decided at 6:20 in a cold car that he'd rather be wrong loudly than right quietly, and then 16 inches of movement, and then 2 hours and 54 minutes of standing in the cold feeling sick. That's it, that's all it ever is. Everybody thinks a door is about keeping people out. It isn't, any wall does that. A door is a promise. It says, there is something behind me worth the trouble, and someone is looking after it, and it will be here when you come back. And a promise is only worth anything if somebody, somewhere, is willing to be hated for keeping it. I stood in front of a door for 6 minutes. They can put whatever they like in the papers. The door was shut.